welcome you to the 76 Queen Street, the Embroiderers Guild of New South Wales.
Thank you.
Yvette is a member and a tutor, and we've many times had discussions over traditional embroidery as I try to understand it. And through Roma Field's books and the works and other pieces in the collection, I'd like to help share some of those things with you. Or we would like to tonight.
Yes, we would.
So, in Roma Field's book, A Lifetime of Embroidery, that was put together by the St Ives group that worked with her for a very long time, Lady Cutler, who was the patron of the Guild at the time, wrote in the foreword of the book, Roma Field's knowledge and love of embroidery is legendary, and her traditional needlework is exquisite and colourful. She also has a genius for making tiny animals for infants and toddlers, and her ducklings, bunny rabbits and teddy bears are treasured in many homes. Miss Field has generously given many hours of her time to teach others the ancient art of embroidery, and she has over the years patiently instructed and encouraged thousands of young girls and women throughout Australia. Most of her work has been with the Embroiderers Guild of New South Wales, where she has shared so much. Sylvia Hudson, who helped put the book together, in her preface says, "We all benefited greatly from the instruction that Miss Field had to offer. A strictly traditional embroideress, there was no end to the information that flowed from her needle." And so it made me very interested in the way people do it their own way. Why they go to traditional, why they go to contemporary, why they go to this stitch, that fabric, that design. And what happened for Miss Field? When she was 17, she had a terrible chest complaint, ended up in hospitals and sanatoriums, and for over 15 years she had a serious illness. She was studying all sorts of things, music as well as embroidery, but with embroidery she could only learn from the magazines and the articles in newspapers of her time. Eventually she was able to use mail order, and that made available techniques, patterns, materials and threads. We all go about this journey in our own way, and I'd like Yvette to tell us some of her way. How did you come to the parts that you love, the stitches, the patterns, the designs?
Yeah. So I did textiles at high school, and we had a really fabulous textiles department at my school, which I considered to be such a privilege. And I had a fabulous teacher. And so when I was in Year 10, we had to do a small sample, so just very small, of hardanger, cross stitch, black work and shadow embroidery. And then of those four, we had to then choose one of those techniques and do a larger piece. And the one that really caught my attention was the hardanger. And so that's where I got into hardanger. And so we had to do a piece of that, and I think the teachers expected we'd do something, you know, about this-ish big. Mine was this big by this big, and I think they thought that I'd bitten off more than I could chew, but, you know, I did it because I loved it. And so that's where my interest came from. I loved hardanger. It wasn't a very traditional piece of hardanger. It was much more contemporary in style. But from there, that's where my interest and love grew. When I left school, I went to university and studied graphic design. And so that fed into the design part of all of this. And I actually majored in book design, which is part of why it's great for me to write books. So when I was working as a book designer, I decided that I'd like to enter a piece into the Nordic needle tradition, the hardanger embroidery design contest. And so I knew it had to be good, so I designed this piece of hardanger, and then it happened to be one of the winners that year, and from that my book writing came about. I had people offer to me that I should write a book for them. And so I decided, my first book was obviously on hardanger, and then after that I started getting more and more into traditional styles of embroidery. And in the back of my mind there was the idea that one day I'd like to write a book on very traditional hardanger embroidery, because most of the stuff out there was very contemporary. And so I did a book on Mount Mellick embroidery with my sister. And so all of my books since that first one have been based very much around the traditional style of embroidery. So I go to the place generally and I research that by looking at very old pieces from museums and studying them, figuring out by looking at the front and the back, because it's really important to understand the structure of the stitch from the back. So I have worked out how to do the embroideries. I've studied many pieces rather than just a small sample, as large a sample as I can, so that I can understand the style, and then I present that information in my books to teach people how to do the traditional style. And particularly with the Mount Mellick book, I've had a lot of feedback from the people in Mount Mellick who have been really thrilled with the way that I presented their embroidery. Actually, because it was I wrote that book with my twin sister, Prue Scott. Yeah, they've been very happy with that, and it makes me feel good to know that I presented their embroidery to the world in a way that made them proud. And that's always my aim, to do that I don't want to present the book in a way that makes them go, oh, well, she didn't quite get that right, did she? I want to do it as traditionally as I possibly can and present the information in a way that makes them proud, because they are the custodians of that embroidery.
Yes.
I'm just an interloper, but I want to do them proud. So I've actually had the most recent book that I did was on Frisian whitework from the Netherlands, and I was approached by a Dutch woman who said, could you write a book on this for us, because we don't want this embroidery to be lost.
Yes.
And when that sort of thing happens, it helped me to understand that I was not just an embroiderer anymore, I was becoming an embroidery historian.
Yes.
People were seeking me out to do that sort of thing.
Yes.
So that's where my love of traditional embroidery comes from, just from studying it more and more and just getting drawn in more and more.
and when you're there in the place with the things and the people, it's a very different feeling.
It is. When you're there, you can understand in the context of the culture that it is.
The why.
So much more.
Yes.
Yeah, so some of the embroideries that I've worked on are not done anymore today, other than by people like me who have taken it up. They've seen the historical style and they've decided to do some things in that. But some of them are still done within the culture as part of their cultural heritage, still being passed down.
The way you would have researched would be very different from the way Roma Field researched.
You would have.
And other traditional embroiderers we have here, like Adele Land, she did her research through the library and the Precious Book Collection.
Yes.
And so your research methods have been quite different from when you first started with the hardanger, and you were happy with the contemporary because you were enjoying the stitch and the movement and the rhythm. Yeah. But more was needed, obviously, because of your other graphic design skills. So then when you start to find out about the designs, and then you found out about the history and the use, the who, what, when, where and why of everything, how did you... Because it's some time since you did the hardanger, how are you finding the differences from how you researched then as to how you're researching now?
So that book was really just me explaining to people how to do the hardanger stitches that I knew.
Right. And you'd learnt them from your teacher, or did they have books in your school, or somebody just told you this is the stitching for hardanger?
So the basic cluster blocks and that sort of thing I would have been taught by my teacher at school.
Right.
But then other parts I would have learnt that all from books.
Yes.
Yeah. So
was that your school library was so well set up for textiles, or you had access to other books, or...?
My parents bought me some books that were very useful. There may have been stuff in the school library, but I really doubt that because it's very niche.
Yes.
So I would say it was probably my personal collection.
Yeah, so they knew how to help you build up your personal collection.
They did.
Okay, so then the first time you travelled there to Hardanger, which is a town, a city.
It's a region.
It's a region. Good. when you actually travelled to the region, what were you able to see there? Were there galleries? Were there little museums?
So I went to the Hardanger Folk Museum in Utne, which is on the side of the Hardanger Fjord. And the correct way to say this is Hardanger.
Hardanger.
And we Australianised it to be Hardanger.
Fair enough.
Yes. And I'm going to keep saying Hardanger because
That's all right.
that's the way we say it.
We understand.
Yes. So I spent some time there with one of the curators, and she took me down to their archives, and drawers of things were opened, and I got to look at some really old pieces, like from the 1700s. So some of the oldest pieces of Hardanger that they still have. I also spent some time at the Norsk Folk Museum in Oslo. So yeah, just seeing really old pieces and going right back to where it came from.
And so were those pieces clothing, furnishing, decorations for homes?
So traditionally where they used their Hardanger embroidery was on their folk costume, which is called bunad.
Okay.
So they would have Hardanger down the front of their shirt,
Right.
on the yoke, they would have it on the collar, they would have it on the cuffs,
Right.
then they would have it on, and I'm going to show you one of my pieces here, on their apron. So over the top of their skirt they would have an apron with Hardanger across the bottom, and you can see from that Hardanger was always worked in a band within fabric.
Right.
So it didn't have its own edge, apart from the edge here.
Yes.
It didn't have, say, the buttonhole edge that we
Right.
think of as being very traditional.
see.
It
Okay.
wasn't used.
Right.
And they also had an incredible pleated headdress, which didn't have any Hardanger on it, but there was often a band of Hardanger that went around that.
Okay.
And so that's where the Hardanger was found.
Right. So within that, then, this is their it's his identification, and this is part of their status. But first of all, it's their place.
Yes.
It's the place where they're from, that they're
Yes.
proud to be from.
Yes.
And also, in its own funny way, their tribe.
Yes.
And so within that, did you notice that was any like power or class or status, or just belonging was what stood out?
That's a very difficult question to answer because I've not been there at the time
Right.
when that was... Well, I was there. I was in Norway for Norwegian Constitution Day,
Right.
which is a day where they all come out in their traditional clothing and they parade.
Right.
And so you can tell where people are from,
Yes.
or where their grandmother was from, because they
Okay.
might choose their grandmother's bunad rather than
Right.
their own place that they come from. So there would be status in it, I'm sure, because those who had the more spectacular bunads would be...
Yes. Just
looked-
quiet messages that are
Yeah,
sent.
I think so.
Yes.
Yeah, but in times past, you would have stitched your own. These days, it's all outsourced to
Okay.
the lady in town who does
Fair enough.
the aprons,
Yes.
or the lady in town who does the jackets.
Yes.
And very sadly, some of it's being outsourced overseas now to
Yes.
piece workers.
Yes. Well, I've actually seen things like that in China.
Yeah.
The German room.
Yeah.
It's very interesting because I'm very interested in the history of it all.
Yeah.
And the movement of ideas and fabrics, the trade.
Yes.
The history of trade is completely left out of our English history.
Yeah.
It's very, very quiet. But when you come to relearn history through embroidery, the movement and the trade is fascinating.
Yes.
And then the other labelling.
Mm-hmm.
And I learnt about, in Palestine, the cross-stitch on the front of the dresses, whether they were Bedouin people or many, many different groups there where people have come and gone and everything. That was very important because it labelled a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And it told some you can come near and some you better stay away.
Yes.
And so that was very interesting to see because to us it was just colourful cross-stitch geometric patterns.
Yeah.
Then recently we heard a lecture in Wagga with Sam Balker, and it was on African textiles, and it was called Art, Power and Textiles.
Right.
And the designs of the Nigerian with the beautiful chain-stitch shapes, they were for the powerful men.
Okay.
And then there were others from other places, and that was for the powerful women to wear.
Mm-hmm.
And what everybody else wore were printed or just plain.
Yeah.
But the embroidery and the design were sending these messages of power.
Yeah.
So the status and the class were there,
Yeah.
and place was there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very, very old tradition that the designs in the things we find are telling a story.
Yeah. So in the Hardanger costume, you can tell whether a woman is married or not by whether she wears the headdress or not.
Yes.
So there are those little clues as well.
Yes. And they're in a lot of things. And now with the Frisian that you've done recently, that's a very, very specific area, and people are very, very proud of being there and what they've achieved, because it's a difficult place to live and nobody's made it easy for them.
Yeah.
So, especially the women, I suppose.
Yeah.
So how did you manage your research there? Because now it's a few years on since you did the Hardanger one.
Yeah.
How was your research?
So I went to the Netherlands twice for that book. The first time I piggybacked it onto a trip to Norway to research my Smoig book, and I went to meet the lady who had asked me whether I would write the book. I wanted to, first of all, just assess whether there was enough in the historical record for me to study, because although Mrs. Kafoops might do beautiful embroidery, if she's the only one doing it, you can't really call that a style. So I needed to know that there was a wide range of things for me to study in order to decide whether I would write that book. So I went over, and she and her friend took me to some museums. The actual museum that I really needed to go to was closed at the time for renovation, so that was a pain in the neck. But they took me to a private collection where a lady had some amazing pieces.
Right.
Her whole collection was just incredible. And so she had some beautiful pieces there, and I was able to see from that and another a small amount that I saw at another museum that they took me to, that yes, there was enough in the historical record. So then once I'd finished writing the Smoig book, and I said to them at the time, I'd like to write your book, but you'll have to wait, because I needed to get the Smoig book done first. And so then I went back to the Netherlands some years later and went to the Fries Museum in Leeuwarden, which is the one that had been closed previously. Right. And I spent 2 days with the curator there, having an amazingly fabulous time looking at embroidery. And so she brought out boxes and boxes of things for me. Yeah. And when I do my research like that, basically what I do is I look at everything and I photograph the front and the back. I photograph detail so that I'm not doing my research there, but I can go away and do it later.
So from her and your other visit and the private collection, did you see there was consistency in pattern, consistency in design, and materials and threads, and their reasons? What were they clothing again to say we are Frisian people, or what do you think their reasons for doing it were? So
there are two main two main things that the Frisian work was done on, and that is on samplers and on the men's shirts.
Right.
It was also done a bit on bedclothes, sewed sheets and coverlets and that sort of thing. But predominantly what we have left to us are the shirts and the samplers. Now the samplers were samplers. They sampled the stitches, the colours, the motifs that were then used on the men's shirts.
Okay.
On the collars, and there was a little bit down the front as well.
Right.
And was it on the cuffs? Dear me, you would think that I would remember these things.
Never mind. But that answers and their reasons. And it was very important. Very important. Identity was very important.
Yes.
So, did you have any more you want to add on those sort of things?
No, that's good.
Were you able to get to understand the traditional fabrics of the areas that you worked to?
That is one of the main things that I want to look at when I'm there, and that's one of the things, like I could look up the stitches and things in books, but it's going to these places and seeing the historical pieces that helps me to understand scale.
Yes.
It helps me to understand the thread that they used,
yes,
the stitches that they used,
yes,
and the fabric that they
yes,
used. Because if I am going to then teach other people how to do these things, I want to show them at the right scale.
Yes.
And scale is determined by your fabric count so often.
Yes.
And if you've got a specific fabric count, then you need a specific size thread to go with that.
Yes.
So sometimes we are very much limited by what's available to us now.
Yes.
Because we don't have the fine fabrics.
No.
Like some of the pieces that I saw in the Frieze Museum were on 100 count fabric.
And were they linens from the local area?
I don't know the answer to that. They were definitely linen, but whether they
Yes.
were from the local area, I don't know.
Because that area of Flanders and everything, that was linen, wasn't it? Wasn't that the lowlands of Northern Europe? Isn't that where they grew lots of the flax and the linens?
I am ignorant of these
Belgium?
facts. I don't know. Belgium,
linen?
definitely,
Belgian
yes.
linen?
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
You imagine that it's quite possible.
Yeah. But
And otherwise, if not, then trade.
Yes. And then the stitches used to achieve the design, because a lot of them are geometric designs, rather than swirly ones.
Yes.
So those stitches, do you see a repetition of that across cultures?
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
So one of the things, didn't bring any Friesian with me.
That's all right.
One of the things that is said to be unique to Friesian whitework is a star. I've got this piece here, and I'll show it to you close up by sticking a picture in. And it's got stars, so this is Norwegian rather than Friesian, but the Friesian version of this, rather than having the stitches in line with the fabric, they would go diagonally across the fabric.
Right.
And that is said to be unique to Friesian whitework, but it's not. It's also found in Ukrainian embroidery.
Yes.
And probably elsewhere too, but it's that diagonal stitch which is the really important bit, which is, it is quite unusual.
Yeah.
Now, I would like to show you some of the embroideries that I brought, but I want to ask you some questions first.
Okay.
How do you see traditional embroidery as important in today's modern society, and is it important?
Well, I do think it's important, because I think people are always thinking and worrying and everything, and it's our traditions that help us understand. There's a lot of people who say, without learning history, you make mistakes in the future.
Yeah.
And we've all seen that.
Yeah.
And that was, the history of our cultures is as strong as the history of our wars and the kings and the queens and all of that.
Yeah.
And the history of the individual cultures and what became nationalism, but then that was used by other people.
Yeah.
But for a man or a woman in many countries to sit down and stitch, to wear, for those Frisian men to wear the shirt that had been made, that was his sense of belonging and a sense of pride.
Yeah.
And we all need to belong.
Yeah.
So I really feel that. But then we've always got curiosity. So we want to see a little bit of what the other one's got, and then we might use their shapes or they might use their colours, and we definitely all swap fabric and threads.
Oh, definitely. I've actually found that in writing my books, I sometimes have women who write to me and say, my husband is, say, Frisian, and so I'd like to work some of the projects out of your book for him, but also, I'm assuming, so that she has some feeling of connection to his culture and some understanding of that as well. Yes. Or it might be her own culture. Yes. And so there's this link with the past that we can get by doing these things as well.
I think the link with the past is necessary to all of us, even though not everybody admits it or gets as excited as we do. But that knowing where you're from, that knowing that you actually belong, that you're not all on your own. We all can feel all on your own. But if you're in the middle of a design of something and the leaves are moving this way and the little diamonds are moving that way, and it's a sense of belonging of thousands of years of other people stitching and decorating. Yeah. Decoration's very important to us all.
Thanks. So what does traditional embroidery mean to you? And by that I don't mean a definition of what it is, but what's its significance for you personally?
It's a deeper way of seeing by feeling. I'm a very sensitive, touchy person, I've finally learned.
Right.
I do have very sensitive skin.
Yeah.
But I have to love the feel of the fabric I'm using and the feel of the threads.
Yeah.
And then in doing the stitches, understanding, I don't know, that something about being part of the world, that being part of culture, because in Australia we're such a lovely muddle of everything.
Yeah.
And I really love all of that. And I think that we can take the best of all of those things. But we certainly have a need to understand that we all go back for thousands of years. We didn't just...
Yeah.
And we're part of all that. And part of that is part of us too.
Yeah.
And there's a great sense of satisfaction in working with a design. Recently, in an Indian book written by an Indian lady that I found about traditional things, there was pattern darning as the oldest area of pattern darning is Karnataka near Bangalore in India.
Okay. Yeah.
So I'd done pattern darning a few times. It's a very calming thing. So I started doing it the way they said, and their little motifs and everything. Well, I had a lovely time, and it was going to go into the Roma Field as a traditional piece, only I didn't get the ending off very good. Next time. But that being aware that the pattern darning, the Holbein stitch, has carried on and on and on, and we're still doing pattern darning in all different ways.
Yeah.
And look at everybody at the moment who wants to do the running stitch, the Cantha work, and now they've decided the Japanese one with the same running stitch.
Yeah.
And we just want to belong. We want to be part of it. I just love it. I just love it.
So I've brought some pieces from my own collection, and I think all of the ones that I have to show you now, none of them are my work. So some of them I have purchased when I've been on my travels, and some of them have actually been, one of them's been given to me by someone. So this first one is a piece of Narvasam embroidery, which is, and I'm going to put it in front of me because then you can see it.
Yes.
That is from Sweden, and it's worked by taking threads out and weaving them back in again, and this is a very traditional form of embroidery, and I think all of these have different names for the motifs. It's not something that I've ever studied, so I'm not really, I'm by no means any sort of expert on it, but it's a beautiful style of embroidery, and
fascinating fabric.
It says something about Sweden, because I think Narvasam means something like birch bark embroidery. And the reason why that is they used to work it from the back and they'd sew it onto a piece of birch bark. So where else in the world would you do that? It's Swedish. So it really says something about the culture there.
Yes. And whether that's a fabric that they've created out of their own weaving, you know, that's intriguing too. But it's the stitches that look like weaving.
Yeah.
And they're in every direction you can imagine.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. So that was actually a gift sent to me by Debbie Fay. I don't know if that's actually how you say her name, but she used to be one of the owners of Nordic Needle. And she had a few pieces and she offered to send them to me as someone who might treasure them, and I do.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
So this is a piece of Guimarães embroidery, which came from the town of Guimarães in Portugal. So I wrote a book on Guimarães embroidery some years ago, and the part of the embroidery that I focused on was the bit with cut work and drawn thread work. But this is the other part of that embroidery, which is very freestyle and beautiful. It still has the many bullions, though not quite as many. And it was always done in traditional colours, and this is one of those traditional colours, which is DMC 796.
Oh, very good. Very good. Very good.
And then this is also from Guimarães, and that's more the style embroidery that I focused on in the book, which it's got the cut work. So you take out threads, you bind them back together to make all these little bits, and then you work the bullions and the eyelets and things on them.
And that just gives it the amazing texture.
Yeah.
That's lovely.
And I've always said about this style of embroidery, if you're not really fond of bullions, you're not really sure about doing them, do a piece of this, you'll be great at them by the end of it.
Oh, practice makes perfect.
Exactly. So I wanted to show this again, which we did see slightly before. This is a cuff from a piece of clothing, from Bunad. Now this is not hardhanger embroidery, this would be wholesome, which is like hardhanger, but it doesn't have the cut work. It's just got the pulled thread eyelets instead, and there's cable stitch and things like that. And this is one of my most treasured pieces. I found that in an antique store on the shores of the Hardanger Fjord.
Oh, lovely.
And the store just happened to be open that day.
Yes.
So I went in.
Sometimes you're lucky.
Yes. Now this is a piece of Mount Mellick embroidery. It is a nightdress case, so it opens up and you would store your nightdress in there. Very practical for today's modern woman.
But then you'd put it on the bed, so it would look lovely.
Yes, and you would put this with your pillow sham that you had also worked.
Yes, initials.
So this has the traditional edging, which is a knitted edging around it. It's done on very heavy cotton satin jean, which is also the traditional fabric, and it's done with completely matte thread, which is also traditional.
Yes.
So it was a knitting
local
cotton
flowers.
Yes, that's right.
Traditional local flowers.
All the flowers that they used came from along the riverbanks of the River Owenass that flows through Mount Mellick, except for things like tiger lilies, which really only would have been grown in hothouses.
Right.
And then the last piece that I have is very different to the others. This is a man's shirt from Ethiopia, and this really says something about Ethiopian culture as well. Their clothing is always white. I do not understand how they keep it clean. But they do, and then they have this embroidery which is mostly chain stitch, and this one particularly is worked in the Ethiopian colours.
You know what sort of thread that is?
It's a wool thread.
Okay. Because it almost looks like floss, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it's wool.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
So that they would have wool there?
Yes. Yeah.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
So, they are the pieces that I brought along to show you today.
Wonderful.
I hope you've all enjoyed them.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I've enjoyed our chat.
Yes,
thank you.
Have I. Thank you for inviting me.
I think I've learnt a lot, and I'm looking forward to learning about other people's traditions and other people's love of traditional embroidery.
Yeah.
And so, exhibition coming up?
Yes. Now, we do have a few pieces that I'm going to insert into the end of the video here, which are some Roma Field pieces that we pulled out from the collection.
Oh, yes.
So we will show them to you following this. Exhibition of the competition, there will be other pieces on display here as well, won't
there? There will be Roma Field pieces. We have several of her books, The Lifetime of Embroidery. There were only so many printed, but they are coming back as donations.
Okay.
And this one, in beautiful conditions, come from the Eastwood group,
right?
Which is very special. And a lot of good traditional embroiderers were in those groups.
Yeah.
Now, the other part, we will have also examples from the collection, other traditional embroiderers, and people like Adele Land who could use more than one traditional technique and then create her design around it. We want to bring the conversation through to loving a traditional design like this, although this was one created for trade, and like this that was created for place and status and who you are and where you're from. There's also people who just want to repeat traditional and learn the tradition because it means something about who they are and where they're from. And then there are others who want to learn the traditional stitches and then combine them into something else. So we want to show the whole gamut of everything that we can help you learn from the Guild.
Yeah, because there's people like me who like a set of rules and sit inside those rules generally, but there are other people who like to use these as a jumping off point to do their own thing, and that's fine too.
But even within that, that was interesting that what you learnt at school with the hardanger, and they're giving you the stitches and everything, and you could create your own design. You could do that for school. You had enough
understanding. I didn't create my own design. Oh. No.
You chose the size.
I did. I adapted a design.
Yes.
So it was this sort of size, and I repeated it twice.
Well, there you are. That's part of what Adele Land did, and apparently that's part of design. And choosing what you like, I've been told, is part of design. So all of that just helps us to learn more and more. And this is the place to learn it all.
Oh, it certainly is.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's been great fun.
Good.